Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the launch of Breaking the Plastic Wave 2025, an assessment of the global system and strategies for transformative change. This is the Pew Charitable Trust's new report into the scale and impacts of plastics and the actions needed to drive meaningful change. My name is Louise Beale. I will be your host and moderator today and guiding our conversation. Now, if you're watching this live and need captions or for this event to be translated, please click live translation in the box to the right of the live stream video, where you can select your preferred language to see subtitles or listen to translated audio. 5 years ago, the first Breaking the Plastic Wave helped shift how the world understands plastic pollution. It showed that plastic pollution cannot be solved by cleanup and recycling alone. The challenge is systemic, shaped by decisions made long before plastic becomes waste. It calls for system-wide solutions. Since then, we have gained new evidence and better data, but the picture that emerges is clearer and even more troubling. Plastic can harm human health at every stage of its life cycle. Plastic production is growing at twice the speed of the systems we have to manage it. And without transformational action, the volume of plastic polluting our land, air and waters is projected to more than double by 2040. It will reach the equivalent of nearly a garbage truck a second. This has severe implications for ecosystems, economies, and human health. But this is also a story of possibility. The research we are launching today shows that plastic pollution can be reduced by more than 80% and almost eliminated from one of the leading sources, packaging, with existing solutions. Reducing production of new plastics, improving product and system design, scaling better waste management, and increasing transparency across supply chains can deliver significant benefits. These actions can protect nature, improve public health, and create new jobs and business opportunities. Our goal today is to provide clarity and support-informed decision-making. As governments prepare for UNEA 7 and continue to work towards a global plastics treaty, we hope this discussion will help frame what is at stake and what is possible. Shortly, we will hear from Dr. Winnie Lau, Project Director for the Pew Charitable Trust's efforts to reduce plastic pollution, who is going to present some of the key findings of the report. We will then have a panel discussion with some brilliant leaders from science, policy, and industry who will bring further insight to our conversation. First, though, we wanted to play you this short film.
No longer the stuff of science fiction, the great advancements of the future are now here for all. Plastics are transforming our modern lives, from plates, clothing, and toys, to furniture, car parts, and even in the skies above. Everything imaginable can be made of plastic, and the future of the industry is bright.
Before 1950, plastic was barely a part of everyday life. Today, plastic is everywhere. While there are essential life-saving plastics in medical devices and engineering equipment, the growing appetite for plastic is putting people and our planet at risk. A decade ago, scientists estimated that the equivalent of one garbage truck of plastic was making its way to the ocean every minute. The new Breaking the Plastic Wave report from Pew finds the situation could escalate to one garbage truck per second into the environment by 2040 if we carry on as we are. The global plastic system and the pollution it unleashes, from physical waste to toxic chemicals, all have far-reaching consequences for the environment, climate, and human health. Plastic litters the deepest depths of the ocean and the highest mountain peaks, and microplastics have been found in our lungs, blood, brain, and even in the placenta of unborn babies. Plastic exposure has already been linked to serious health issues, including heart disease, asthma, and cancer. But there is still hope. The technologies, solutions, policies, and innovations already exist to reduce plastic pollution by as much as 83% by 2040 and nearly eliminate the pollution from plastic packaging. Even though the challenges have grown since Pew's first Breaking the Plastic Wave in 2020, the opportunity to make a difference is still within reach. To meet this urgent need, transformational change must happen throughout the global plastic system. Through measures such as reducing plastic production, redesigning products, improving waste management, and increasing transparency in the plastic supply chain. Although this is a sizable challenge, tackling it will create benefits extending far beyond just protecting the environment, such as reducing harm to human health, helping alleviate poverty, creating new local jobs and business opportunities, and saving governments billions of dollars in waste management costs. Now, more than ever, we need urgent, coordinated action from companies, governments, and policymakers. Let's put people and the planet first and create a sustainable future for all.
We hope that film really resonates with you all. Now, before I pass over to Winnie, I wanted to let you all know that if you're watching this live, we'd love it if you pose some questions to our panel a little bit later on, and you can start sending in those questions as soon as you want by using the submit a question box, which you should be able to see on the right-hand side of the live stream. And as I said, you can submit those questions as we go, and we will get to them a little bit later in our panel debate. Now, let's get started. And to do that, as I said, we're going to hear from Dr. Winnie Lau, who's going to talk us through the report's findings. Winnie, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Louise. 1 garbage truck worth of plastic every second going into our environment. That is the projected future if we continue as we are. It has been 5 years since Pew released the first Breaking the Plastic Wave report, and we find the problem bigger and growing. The new report, Breaking the Plastic Wave 2025, is an expanded 5-year follow-up to our 2020 report and provides new insights into the breadth of the plastic problem and strategies for transformative change. We produced this report with the support of ICF International and 4 thought partners: the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Imperial College London, Systemic, and the University of Oxford. Our aim is to provide a deeper understanding of the scale of the environmental, economic, health, and social impacts of the global plastic system to all parts of the environment beyond just the ocean, and to support and encourage decision makers as they respond to critical global issues, evaluate trade-offs, and implement solutions. Despite growing attention to the plastic pollution problem over the last 5 years, we find the trajectory has barely shifted. If we carry on as we are, annual plastic pollution will more than double in the next 15 years, increasing from 130 million metric tons to 280 million metric tons. And in the intervening 5 years since the 2020 report, an additional 570 million metric tons of plastics have made it to our land, air, and water. Business as usual is simply an untenable trajectory. This increase in plastic pollution will be primarily driven by rapidly growing production and use of plastic that will further overwhelm already strained waste management systems. Over the next 15 years, plastic production will rise twice as fast as our capacity to manage it, leading to a widening gap between what is produced and what is properly managed and disposed. The share of plastic waste that is uncollected will have nearly doubled despite a 30% increase in waste management costs. By 2040, annual costs to collect and dispose of plastic waste will reach $140 billion a year. The impacts of the plastic system extends beyond pollution. Plastic can harm human health at every stage of its life cycle. It has been linked to serious health conditions, including cancer, heart disease, asthma, decreased fertility, and cognitive and developmental issues. In 2025, Plastic production and waste alone are responsible for 5.6 million years of healthy life lost globally. What this means is that productivity and quality of life are affected due to illness, disability, or even premature death. And this loss in healthy, quality life will rise by 70% to nearly 10 million years by 2040. Because of data gaps, we did not incorporate the impacts arising from plastic use and microplastics into our analysis, but these are likely to be significant. The mounting research already shows microplastics have been found throughout our bodies and are already linked to digestive, reproductive, and cognitive health concerns. And more than a quarter of the 16,000 chemicals used in plastics have so far been identified as potentially hazardous. Over the next 15 years, annual greenhouse gas emissions from the global plastic system will increase by 58% to 4.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. This is equivalent to the emissions from 1 billion gasoline-powered cars. The production phase contributes by far the biggest share of greenhouse gas emissions from the plastic system. Over 80% of plastic-associated emissions occur during plastic production. If the global plastic system were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitting nation by 2040. On the current trajectory, the rising emissions from the global plastic system will pose a challenge to achieving the commitments under the Paris Agreements. And I want to highlight the particular challenge of microplastics as a form of plastic pollution. Their small size makes them difficult to capture, and they're nearly impossible to clean up once they are in the environment. In 2025, 13% of plastic going into the environment comes from just 7 sources of microplastics: tires, paints, recycling, agriculture, textiles, pellets, and personal care products. Of these, the largest sources are tires and paint, which both generate microplastics through everyday use and wear and tear over time, then followed by agriculture and recycling. Our analysis provides some of the first estimates of global microplastic pollution from agricultural plastics and finds that it is the fastest growing among these 7 sources, increasing by 66% over the next 15 years. As a whole, these 7 sources of microplastics account for 17 million metric tons of plastic pollution in 2025, and this will grow by 50% to 25 million metric tons by 2040 under business as usual. Of particular note, in high-income countries, microplastic pollution will make up 79% of their overall plastic pollution by 2040. Despite troubling trajectories, there is hope. Solutions exist that can cut plastic pollution by 83% by 2040. They can also nearly eliminate pollution from plastic packaging, one of the leading causes of plastic pollution, reducing this by 97%. And reuse systems will be a key in delivering this success. Microplastic pollution can also be cut by 41%, and even more with innovation. To achieve this possible future, where the challenge of plastic pollution can be solved, a system transformation is required. This system transformation will first entail a reduction in plastic production and use. The recommended actions in the report point to the potential to cut primary plastic production by 14% in 2040 from 2025 levels, while maintaining the same level of service for consumers and businesses. Next, we also need to rethink the chemicals used to make plastic products and the design of those products, as well as the systems used by businesses to get them to people. For example, shifting to new business and delivery models that feature reusable packaging, phasing out low utility and avoidable plastics, improving product design to shed less microplastics, and transitioning away from toxic chemicals that harm people and wildlife. Third, we need to vastly improve our waste management systems, making them more efficient and environmentally sound, while at the same time ensuring those workers who are crucial to waste management systems have a voice in those changes. And lastly, we need to embed transparency throughout the plastic supply chain. Better understanding of how plastic moves through the economy is key to developing effective policies and employing cost-efficient solutions. And better understanding of what is in plastics and their potential harm is key to protecting human health. Implementing system transformation will yield huge benefits for our environment, economies, and human health by 2040. There will be less exposure to air pollution, chemicals, and waste in the environment, which will lead to reducing health impacts from plastic production and waste by 54%, with significant reductions also likely for those impacts related to plastic use and microplastics. Greenhouse gas emissions associated with the plastic system will be cut by 38%. It will save governments $19 billion annually on plastic collection and disposal, while also creating 8.6 million additional jobs supporting local economies and providing better pay and conditions for vulnerable workers. Implementing system transformation will shift investment into technologies and solutions of the future, unlocking new business opportunities with sustainable solutions, a market already valued in the trillions of dollars. This global plastic pollution problem can be solved. It can only happen through an unprecedented level of coordinated global action between governments and businesses. And it will require a commitment of resources and existing technologies, strategic policy approaches, and continued innovation. But most crucially, it will require a fundamental change in mindset and approach, where the health of people and planet is prioritized in all decisions that are made. And if we do, we can solve this problem within a generation and safeguard future generations. Thank you. Back to you, Louise.
Winnie, many thanks indeed for that. Well, I'm delighted to say we're now going to carry on the conversation with our expert panel. And for that, I'd like to introduce them to you. We have a brilliant panel. We have Ambassador Sophia Sawney. Ambassador Sawney is the Special Advisor and Climate Envoy for the Government of Grenada and Senior Ocean, Biodiversity and Climate Policy Specialist for Small Island Developing States. She is committed to enhancing ocean resilience and advancing climate action, which is clear in her contributions to the Plastics Treaty negotiations and her advisory role in the development of ocean and blue economy policies. She will be joined by Jane Munker. Jane is an environmental scientist who has worked on the health impacts of plastic chemicals for more than 2 decades. She specialises in food contact materials like packaging. Jane is part of the Plastic Chem project that compiled an inventory of the known over 16,000 plastic chemicals used in plastic and is also a member of the Scientists' Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. We will also be joined by Ted Janulis, the founder and principal of Investable Oceans, which is an ocean investment hub based in New York City that accelerates market-based sustainable ocean investing across all asset classes and sectors of the blue economy. He has had a business career spanning over 35 years and served in various executive positions, including CEO at financial institutions involved in capital markets, banking, and asset management. They will be joined by Betty Ajay. Betty is a global speaker, climate activist, and circular economy strategist dedicated to advancing zero waste solutions across Africa and beyond. She pioneers community-driven initiatives that transform waste into economic opportunities, divert materials from landfills, and advocates for climate justice. Her work merges research, advocacy, and grassroots action to empower youth, formalise the informal waste sector, and build a future where reuse is the norm and not the expectation. And last but certainly not least, we have Alison Lin. Alison is the Global Vice President of Healthy Planet and Chief Circularity Officer at Mars, where she leads the cross-segment strategy, goals, and target development for climate, deforestation, water, land use, and packaging. She spent the majority of her career driving sustainability initiatives through value chain collaboration at a variety of different companies. To all of the panel, thank you very much for being with us. It is absolutely great to have you here. Just a quick reminder before we start that if you are watching this live, remember you can use the submit a question box to the right-hand side of the live stream to be able to do that, and we'd love to get your questions. Panel, welcome, thank you. I'd like to kick off, if I may, with Ambassador Sawney to say that, well, Breaking the Plastic Wave 2025 clearly shows the need for collective action if we're to solve the plastic pollution problem. What, in your view, is the way forward to achieve that, Ambassador Sawney?
Great. Thank you so much, Louise. And I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I think in preparing for this panel, I shared with the panelists that I've dedicated maybe the last 2.5 years of my life committing to trying to deliver a global plastics treaty. So I'm always very happy to talk on this topic. I'd like to congratulate Pew for sharing this new report on breaking the plastic wave. And certainly, Winnie, your presentation was very eye-opening, but I think it's the sort of messaging and narrative that's really important for the audience and really allows us to have a foundation and a context for our discussion. So in terms of how do we move forward and how do we achieve it, I think I will speak primarily from a small island government perspective. We see the delivering of the Global Plastics Treaty as fundamental to moving forward on implementing solutions. Many of our governments have put in place policy and legislation to try to tackle the issue of single-use plastics. And we have had several challenges in enforcing and implementing those regulations and legislation. And that is simply because this is a problem that we need to solve collectively. It is important that as we consider delivering the Global Plastics Treaty, that we do so by remaining ambitious, by remaining to the commitments that many of our governments have signed on to when they delivered Resolution 514 in 2022, that speaks to implementing change across the entire life cycle of plastic, from the point of production to the point of waste management. For us, the only solution is transformative change. And I think a lot of the elements Winnie has touched on at the very end of her presentation. For small island developing states, we will continue to build the policy and legislative environment, as well as the enabling environment. We will continue to work with many of our stakeholders to communicate and ensure that the knowledge and the decision-making that's needed to put implementation measures in place that are effective will continue in the long term. And we will continue to work together cross-regionally as well with our international partners to deliver on those solutions, including being able to deliver transformations and innovations that we tend to not have access to. For us, getting the plastic treaty delivered means providing resources to our governments, allowing us as vulnerable countries that are on the front line of this issue to continue to put in place solutions and lead within this negotiations for vulnerable states. So I know we have a lot of panels ahead, but I'll end here, and I'm open to any sort of questions or responses anyone has. So over to you, Louise.
Well, thank you. Actually, I was just going to follow up to say, do you think we still can get an international treaty?
I think we can. I think when we first started off the process, we had a very ambitious date of delivering within 2 years. We've seen the many changes in the geopolitical nature of conventions, and unfortunately, this process has not been protected from that. What we have seen is a change really in the last few months of ensuring that we get the process right. We sort of struggled the last year to ensure that the process is one that considers all views, but also considers that we're starting off from this very ambitious legislation that we agreed to in 2022. And we shouldn't fail to recognize that this is the compass that we need to follow. So we see there's a lot, at least this last INC negotiation in Geneva, I think it was quite promising because it was the first time we were able to start working towards compromise, where we're not considering, some of the more ambitious measures, but we're starting to consider it within a compromise scenario that allows us to still deliver on the objective of ending plastic pollution.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to come to Betty, to you next. We've heard obviously from Sophia in terms of where she thinks the priorities are, but what I'd like to hear from your point of view, why is plastic pollution such an urgent issue?
Interesting. Thank you very much for that question. Let me start this way with a story. When I was little, I spent part of my childhood in a slum, a place where waste wasn't just a noun, it was almost like a neighbor. Plastic sachets lined our gutters like wallpapers, and you can just hear the smoke and perceive the smoke from the burning trash. And sometimes you could feel like you can taste it. And still, life went on. Children played, mothers cooked, and informal waste pickers searched through the piles of waste just to survive. Years later, I learned something that I could have never have imagined as a child. The plastic that surrounded me had also been found inside me. And how did this come about? I took a plastic exposure test with the Mindero Foundation, and I found out that my body carried medium levels of harmful chemicals, from bisphenols to parabens to phthalate oxybenzone. I think that moment really shook me, and it made me realize that plastic pollution had become very personal. It stopped being an environmental issue and it has become more of a human crisis. And this is why it's so urgent. It's so real. And I really love the Breaking the Plastic Wave report when I read through it, seeing the hard numbers. They were like alarms telling us that if we do nothing, plastic is leaking into our ocean and they will triple in the coming years. It's mind-blowing. But behind these numbers, it's just important to say that there are people, there are families, there are communities. Plastic pollution is urgent, not just because it litters our ocean, but because it's quietly redesigning our future without our consent. It's locking our ecosystem and our economies into a toxic system, turning our bodies into storage sites for chemicals. That's not good, and deepening injustice within our communities. And we all know that they did not start it. They did not cause this. This is no longer about cleaning up or doing environmental beach cleanups. It's about deciding whether we allow an entire generation to grow up with plastics in their blood and call it development. So this is why plastic pollution is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is really powerful testimony, which I think you can see we're all affected by it. Jane, could I come to you to perhaps expand on that point about we've seen it in the report, but this link between plastics and health, there is a proper link, isn't there? And it does really affect our health.
Hi, Louise. Thank you so much for having me today. Wow, yeah, I completely agree with what the Ambassador Soni and Betty just said. The problem is that plastics are not inert materials. That means that they can and do exchange chemicals with their surroundings, for example, through the air or through direct contact. We have 50 years of reliable scientific evidence showing that chemicals can transfer, for example, out of plastics when it's used to package foodstuff or to process foods. And then, of course, these plastic chemicals will be ingested by people with their diets. But it also means this non-inertness of plastic, that plastics can absorb chemicals. And this becomes a problem when we start reusing or recycling plastics or repurposing these materials, because then the plastics kind of become vectors to bring toxic chemicals back into our homes and even into our bodies. So one example are black plastic kitchen utensils that have been found on markets across the world to contain levels of flame retardants, highly, highly toxic, persistent chemicals, which are not allowed to be used in food contact materials. But they get in there because black plastic from electronic waste is illicitly recycled into kitchen utensils. And so people get exposed to these brominated flame retardants. So that's one way. But it's really also important to point out that it's very difficult to distinguish which plastics have these highly toxic chemicals and which don't. You really need lab analytical equipment for that. It's not something you can just do from the cuff of your hand. What I also want to point out here that actually all commodity plastics, at least those used for food packaging, but also other applications, contain known hazardous chemicals. Wendy touched on this briefly when she mentioned that there were over 4,000 plastic chemicals already known to be hazardous. And the other ones are not hazardous. We just don't have data on these. And so then it sort of becomes a value-based decision whether we assume that plastic chemicals without data are safe or not. It depends on your value preferences. If you are on the side of precaution, you would probably say, I assume they're not safe until I have data to show me that they are safe. A result of this, in a way, careless use of plastics over the last 50 years is now, as Betty said, that people are contaminated with plastic chemicals, including known hazardous chemicals, including carcinogenic chemicals. We know that there are at least 1,396 plastic chemicals that originate from food contact materials that have been detected in human bodies. So I think that kind of shows us that what we are doing right now in terms to control plastics and especially the chemicals, even for contact with food, is not doing its job. And people are getting sick as a result of this, as Winnie alluded to.
Which is pretty sobering to think about. What can be done or what should be done? What are the first kind of steps, in your opinion, Jane, that could be taken?
Well, obviously, it seems like an insurmountable challenge right now. But I do think that building capacity and learning about these issues, building awareness for these issues is really the place where it has to start. And we're doing a good job at that. And also thanks to the Pew Trust for publishing this follow-up report, which will definitely help with this, raising awareness and educating. I think governments, including in low middle income countries, need to build capacity so that their own people know how to deal with these risks. You know, for example, with products that are being imported. I think there's a lot of room for improvement here right now. And I really hope that the Plastics Treaty will allocate the necessary means to these countries that they can build capacity so that it's not going to be, you know, non-consensual agreement, you know, that these products that contain hazardous chemicals come into countries. I think it's really also important, as Betty already alluded to focus on reuse. Reuse systems require different business models. It's not just simply replacing plastics with different materials. If that's where we end, we failed. We really have to redesign how we produce, consume, especially food products that have a fast turnaround. We don't need to ship these across the whole globe. It's much better to focus on local production, consumption, and then we can have reuse systems with inert materials. And that will create new jobs and so on. But it really, I think, requires government actors to enable that because, you know, individual business operators cannot set up those kind of systems and transform the system on their own. I think one next step we can also do is identify which uses of plastics actually are essential. Of course, we still have uses that really are important. That we can't just simply substitute or get rid of right now. And then, of course, as a researcher, I'm always very keen to develop criteria to identify what are actually safer materials, safe and sustainable by design. So looking both at the hazard properties, at the inertness of materials, do they shed microplastics, but also what are the sustainability criteria? How do these materials, their feedstocks, the way they're used, and so on, impact the environment? So I think we still have a little bit of research need to develop such criteria. And then, of course, if I may, Louise, industry actors also have a huge opportunity here because I think, you know, a lot of businesses use plastics now and they're kind of, in a way, stuck with this material, locked into this material. But they can ask questions up their supply chain, as Winnie also pointed out, and as the report nicely alludes to, asking these questions in the supply chain. What are the materials that you're using? Where are there risks in portfolios also for financial industry investors? How can we get rid of the most hazardous chemicals? And we, you know, in the research community, we have quite a few ideas to help you out there. So I will end just by saying that also we as citizens have the possibility to reduce our plastic consumption. And I think being aware of it and then also taking the steps where possible to reduce plastic in our daily life is really important.
Okay, yeah, Jane, thank you. Lots in there. And I'm conscious I want to come to business in a moment, but can I, Ambassador Sawney, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Jane said. Well, I wanted to throw it to you really in terms of what she was saying about, you know, getting governments involved in change. Give us your thoughts on that.
Great, and thanks so much. And I also wanted to maybe go back a little bit because she mentioned a lot of elements that we have started to include as part of the negotiations within the INC. So she talked about the need to look at hazardous chemicals. We've had several technical discussions and considerations within the negotiations on how this resulting international legally binding instrument could manage hazardous chemicals. Of course, it's one of the more contentious articles that we've been discussing. We've also included for discussion and consideration an article that looks at alternatives. How do we have the Global Plastics Treaty support a process to introduce alternatives and also to phase out of plastic products that are considered problematic or avoidable, like single use? So these are all discussions and elements that have been considered over the last 2.5 years as we work on delivering the international legally binding agreement. And again, finally, on the point of resources, you know, we've been strong advocates that as vulnerable countries, particularly for small and developing states, there's a legal tenet that recognizes our special circumstances within multilateral environmental agreements. And we continue to advocate quite strongly for that as part of the consideration within the treaty process. What this does is that it ensures that there's a delivery of resources as well as innovation and technology to our vulnerable countries. We're not just dealing with imported plastics. I mean, I think for us, because we're not producers of plastics, we're in a unique situation where with the right information and the right access to technology, we're able to understand the type of materials that we're bringing in and control it at the border. But it's the material that washes up on our shores that we're not responsible for, that we need the support for. And one of the inclusions that we introduced at the last negotiating session was consideration for there to be a process to manage plastics beyond areas of national jurisdiction, because that's really where the problem is. And we, as small island developing states, need to be empowered not just by capacity and resources, but support from the global community to allow us to collectively work to tackle this issue. So there's a lot of these considerations that link back to key elements that have been captured within the report that have been considered as part of the treaty process. And I think it's important for the audience to also understand that we are not doing this in a silo. There's a space for the scientists, there's a space for the researchers, there's also a space for industry. Jane, you mentioned industry. The industry has been saying that they need to get the right signal from us. And part of what we're doing in the delivery of this treaty is to ensure that we can get the right signal out to industry so that we can work collectively with everyone as part of the solution.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, let's move into that area of industry and investment. And perhaps I could come to you, Ted, to start with before we move to Alison. But do you see the investment community engaging in the plastics sector? And if so, how can we go about broadening and deepening capital markets engagement?
Thank you, Louise. And thank you to our other speakers. I'm learning a tremendous amount already from you all. And of course, thank you to Pew Charitable Trusts for including me in this incredible session. As Winnie can attest, I was a huge fan of Breaking Plastic Wave 1 and have been pestering her for quite some time for what's next. And so this is a very important day. So yes, investors are increasingly focused on plastics. And in the same way that plastics are ubiquitous in our lives and they're global and they have value chains that are very complicated, the same is true of investment. So you might have asset managers who are incorporating plastic considerations into their investment process. You could have green bonds where you're dedicating some of the proceeds to plastics or remediation. You could have corporates like Mars, I'm sure we'll hear about this in a minute, who are making investments to tackle these issues. And then you have multilaterals like the World Bank who are de-risking blended finance structures. And then there's a whole array of venture, early stage, late stage, and private equity. So it's across the spectrum, and that's encouraging. But as is the case for climate, oceans, biodiversity, there's a financing gap. And the report really calls that out. So how to unlock more capital. Three quick thoughts, and we can always follow up later, but just to get them out there. First is more data. Investors and donors love data. If you're going to manage risk or measure impact, the better data sets you have, the more consistent, comprehensive, collected over time they are, the better. Now, having said that, data don't live in a vacuum. They live in a data ecosystem. And so it's great that you're partnering with CDP also, because from a reporting perspective, you've got huge reach into the corporate community, and investors watch that. So going from under 3,000 reporters just a few years ago now to over 5,500 reporters on the corporate side, that kind of consistency is very much appreciated and helps us move things along. Data also lives and breathes through taxonomies. And it's encouraging to see not only the development of these taxonomies, but also finally the beginnings of a convergence, because that's what gives us the shared vocabulary to talk about these very nuanced and complicated processes. Taxonomies are critical. And lastly, data-informed research. And the perfect example being this new report that we're talking about today, but I also see today's report as a foundation on which others can build. So as an example, Planet Tracker just a few months ago did a great piece on microplastics, very data-centric, but I think these things come together and really make the data live. So number one is data. Number two, compelling narratives. I think one of the reasons oceans have gained more of a seat at the table is because people have increasingly seen the linkage between ocean health and climate. And that's been a huge part of elevating the oceans as a consideration. But that's really about developing a narrative. And fortunately, you're aligned with Ellen MacArthur Foundation, WWF. We're all masters at creating these kinds of narratives and pushing them forward. So one thing I would note on this point is it's brilliant to have health included this time around in a substantial way, because that's a huge narrative. And we think about microplastics, to pick up on what was said earlier, just a handful of years ago, there wasn't a lot of a widely acclaimed research about the health impacts of microplastics. That's really changed over just the last couple of years. I was at an event recently with Jun Yun from Palo Alto Investors and Carrie Nadeau from the Shan School at Harvard. And we had a group of about 40 people talking about microplastics. I've been to hundreds and hundreds of presentations over my career. I've never seen that level of interaction. Very personal, very tangible. And if you think about corralling that intense interest and converting it into demand signals for the consumer, that will ultimately move investors and the corporates as well. So the last part I would say just very briefly, because we're touching on it other places, is regulatory. And regulatory is vital because corporations and investment managers can only get so far ahead of that curve. Regulatory pieces bind you, but they also give you sort of a safe harbor to pursue these kinds of initiatives. And while I enjoyed hearing the state of the state on the plastics treaty, it's vitally important. But at the same time, it's not lost on us that there are many other initiatives going on, often with Europe leading the way, to really embed these things in regulations. And again, that will help draw more investors into that process. So as a recap on those, data, narratives, and regulation, I think those are three critical building blocks for unlocking more capital.
Okay, Ted, thank you very much indeed. I would like actually to move to Alison really for your response to perhaps some of what Ted's talking about, and if you can tell us about what Mars is doing to tackle plastic pollution. It would be great to get some of that from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So at Mars, the world we want tomorrow means that packaging doesn't become waste and is instead either reused, recycled, or composted. And we have hundreds of associates working on this. We really saw a step change when we built sustainability into executive compensation. So not just having standard business metrics in executive compensation, but linking sustainability, including greenhouse gas reduction and packaging circularity. And to any of the industry companies and other companies on the call, I highly recommend doing this because it shows to the whole organization that you're serious about sustainability and you're serious about this topic. And the metrics that you include are really important too. I think we need to go beyond designing for recyclability and understanding what actually happens to your packaging and to the plastics. Here we need to understand what infrastructure looks like. Different things happen to plastic, whether it's being produced in Europe or in the global South. So we really need to understand what's actually happening to that and building that into your metrics so that you don't have a generic metric, but you're again understanding what's actually happening to your material. And that includes engaging the informal waste sector, right? And thank you for the Pew Charitable Trust for including a large portion of the report on the informal waste sector. To understand what happens to your packaging, a large amount of plastic and packaging waste in general is collected by the informal waste sector and is not actually collected by formal systems. So we need to understand what is of value to them and what's not of value to them, and how do we design better packaging so that we are engaging them and understanding what has value. We are also working on alternative materials. So we are looking at movements to materials like paper for Snickers and Mars bars. We've looked at paper for condiment sauce packaging, and we're continuing to look at paper and alternative materials. And again, understanding what has value in the infrastructure that the packaging is going into. And we're looking at reuse systems too. The other panelists have talked a lot about reuse. So we've done some trials with dry pet food, as well as M&M color walls. And what we've learned is you really need to engage retailers and consumers, as well as your supply chain, because the retailers control what gets put in front of consumers, and the consumers need to control whether something actually gets reused. You can design the best reuse system in the world, but if the consumer doesn't want it, then it doesn't get reused and it becomes just a more expensive, more greenhouse gas intensive package. So we really need to engage consumers and retailers as we look at this reuse transformation. And we're also testing as we look into fibers, looking at alternative fibers. So how do we look at materials that can be regenerative? We use a lot of agricultural products in our foods. So how do we look at packaging that can also be regenerative? How do we look at materials that can work in rotational crop system? I think that's a really exciting new space. And Ted, I think from an investment perspective, there's a lot of really interesting investments and new materials in this space that's right for innovation and investment. So really excited about all those potential opportunities in the future. And if the Plastics Treaty can facilitate and encourage these types of innovations, that will make it easier for businesses to invest. We also recently launched a sustainable investment fund of $250 million to look at alternative materials for packaging, as well as innovative ingredients for other parts of our business. But also that shows that businesses are serious about investment and looking at different types of financial instruments to unlock innovation in this space. And lastly, I'm working with X Prize to evaluate new materials. And that's also really exciting because I think that will inject new funding and new innovation to a different reach so that we can accelerate solutions.
Okay, Alison, thank you. I'd like to come back to Betty actually at this point, Betty, and just ask you, I mean, there's so much we will delve into there, but from what you're hearing from a government perspective and from a business and industry perspective, Betty, do you think do you think enough is being done? What would you like to see from those two elements of society from your point of view?
Yeah, interesting. I love Alison's take, bringing on board individuals or marginalized communities is very important. And also that young people as well, we fall in this category. And that's why I would always say that young people, we don't only just play the role of being campaigners, but we also bring on board solutions and design policies as well, and bring on board a lot of innovation. As several of our work recently, one of it called the Zero Waste Cities model, recently gained global recognition and won the Headshot Prize under the clean air category, which our model was to create over 550 green jobs across African countries, Ghana, Uganda, Botswana, empowering more than 5,000 informal waste speakers. So I really love the fact that Alison brought that in, diverting several tons of waste from landfill and composting site. So I feel like in terms of what should be done, governments should be able to move from policy to implementation, engaging with young people that are on the ground to also serve as, should I say, a stepping stone to see the solution that they want to see. We as young people also have a strong foot in mobilizing communities. Currently, we've been able to shift behaviors when it comes to plastics, ensuring that we detach from single use to reuse within our communities, ensuring that we're able to mobilize communities. We currently have our youth climate councils and eco clubs within universities and local communities that create a vibrant network of over 15,000 young advocates globally. And these structures are nurturing a new generation of climate leaders who are informed, organized, and ready to act. And I'll say that for the past 4 years now, we've not just only supported in movement building, but also supported in innovation and young people bringing their ideas to life through financial tools, capital, international exposures. So from the support we get, from the trust we get, from the courage we get from stakeholders, trusting in young people that they can deliver, we are also then sending that same trust to other young people, decentralizing the flow of fund, the flow of trust, and the flow of integration. I think this is the greatest challenge we are facing. I'm hoping that we move beyond that. We move from government talking about pledges, talking about inclusion, talking about bringing young people on board, to implementing, to supporting the ideas go on. Also ensuring that the innovations that we are setting up within the communities are also being invested in. We don't want to look to false solutions because they only just exacerbate the climate conditions. We don't want incineration within our communities because it just pollutes our air. And talking about global plastic treaty is something that myself, I have been participating for several times now. We hear that these policies are something the government has. If you go back to your national level, they have it, but they would always tell you it's a lack of political will. So I'm hoping that stakeholders can move beyond the talk to the do. And I think lastly, at the end of the day, we should be able to have the capacity of young people being built to match that future innovation that we want to see. And I'm going to end here because of time. Thank you, Lewis.
No, well, no, we're enjoying your perspective, and I actually just wanted to build on that because it sounds obvious, but obviously young people are the future, and they're the ones that are going to have to deal with this as we go forward. Betty, from your experience, do you think the younger generation are involved enough? Is enough being done to get them, or do they feel heard and to get them on board to be able to take this forward?
I think it's 50-50. I think we are gradually moving from an age of tokenism where young people are just brought on board to add to the conversation. I'm hoping that we move to that future where we are participating and adding our voices to the solutions that have been brought on board. And I believe that when we do that, we see the future that we really want to see. Because right now, most of the conversations are, okay, let's bring some young people in there to add on to the conversations. But maybe they're not recognizing our solutions enough because there are still a lot of brilliant ideas out there. Happy enough, their trust is beginning to expand because if not, a youth organization like ours would not have won a £1 million last year from the Headshot Prize. So this is something that we see gaining recognition, but it's not enough. we don't just want global bodies to identify us, we want our national bodies to identify us as well. We are still having this issue of desegregation, young people not being recognized by their government at the national level, and you find outsiders supporting us. So how do we take these messages to our government to say, support us, hear us, use your platform to amplify the solution, invest the money you have so that we can as well support the innovation you're bringing on board, because we have the energy, we have the charisma, and I think we have the AI as well, and this this future should I call it the internet, the future global internet age that we are going to. So there's a necessity for them to tap into us. So I'll just say there's still more to be done, and we are ready. We young people, we are ready.
Betty, thank you. Something that a number of you have been talking about already is innovation. It'd be nice to touch on that a bit further. Ted, if I could come to you, we often hear about innovative companies, innovations, initiatives, replacing plastic packaging with seaweed, that kind of thing. How easy is it to scale projects like that? And does the business community, I guess, have a responsibility to do that?
A great question. Thank you. And to stay with seaweed for a minute, which is, as they say, having a moment. Looking back 5 years, we were talking with Winnie. It was really just, it was a much more distant thing. And now it's come to the fore. Just a few years ago, Tom Ford did a plastics substitute competition, and all three winners, Sway, Napla, and Zero Circle, were all seaweed based. So materials, I'm very optimistic that they can play a role, and eager to hear what Allison has to say about that also. And just as an example, the one unicorn so far from the blue economy is an Icelandic company that, in a quest to use 100% of a cod, found that their skin could be used for deep tissue wounds and burns. And that company sold 2 years ago for $1.3 billion. So I think the uptake of these different technologies and innovations is critical. And there is an ecosystem that's built around it. We're part of 1,000 Ocean Startups, which is over 60 organizations that are blue economy funds, incubators, accelerators, platforms, hubs, and clusters. And we're just crossed 500 companies that our members have supported. About 70 of those are in the plastic area. And that's not any one part. It's anything from solutions like bubble barriers to keep plastic out of the ocean to highly complex chemical processes to do a better job of recycling and upcycling. So there's a lot to do in materials, but that's part of a broader innovation network. And there's a lot going on in finance. As example, funds like Closed Loop Capital and Circulate Capital, Closed Loop Partners, they're dedicated to taking those through the growth stage and getting them these SMEs to larger scale. And that's a critical part of it also. And the last thing I'd say about innovation is I think what we heard from Allison is innovation with a capital I. It's thinking about your entire business model and your reach. And so many people look at Mars as a leading voice in the sector and say, what are they doing? So I think innovating around more holistically around the whole model, I think, is a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah, Alison, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. And I think just building on what Ted said, I think it's essential to look at innovating holistically, right? We don't want to accidentally put in unintended consequences with alternative materials. I think Jane would agree that as we look at alternative materials, we also need to look at the chemicals being used in those alternative materials. Just because it's not plastic doesn't mean it's better. So we need to look at what are the chemicals being used. But more on the more positive innovation side, I do think seaweed and some other materials that are on the horizon have this, again, holistic benefit that we can look at. How are they regenerating the earth? How are they regenerating the oceans beyond just being an alternative to plastics? So I think that is all really exciting, and we need to look at all of that holistically as we look at new materials.
Yeah, Jane, you're nodding. Just along with what Alison said, please jump in, tell us your thoughts.
I'm really inspired because I think it's a huge opportunity to fix something that has been going under the radar for a long time, which is the way that we do chemical risk assessment. And we've established a system for the last 50, 60 years, which clearly is not working because we see increases in chronic diseases worldwide of chemicals caused by chemicals or associated with chemicals, I should say. And these chemicals are leaching out of food packaging, they're leaching out of other consumer products, and these diseases are not being prevented by what's being done, simply because we've got a system that looks at the wrong things, basically, or doesn't look far enough, right? So we know that chemicals can contribute to obesity. We know that chemicals can contribute to infertility, different kinds of cancers, diabetes, allergy, and so on and so forth, neurodevelopmental issues, mental health. And we need to change the way we do chemical risk assessment. And I want to add here, actually, also, as we do that, let's start doing material risk assessment. Let's look at all of the chemicals that leach out of materials because they don't leach one by one, right? And the current paradigm is we look at one chemical at a time, then we say, oh, okay, maybe we set a threshold for this individual chemical, be it BPA, for example, or DHP, the phthalates, or the forever chemicals, PFOA, and so on. But we're exposed to thousands and thousands of chemicals at the same time. So we clearly have an opportunity here as we dive into this innovation, this excitement, working with seaweed or other materials. Let's develop criteria to really make sure these materials are safe. And let's not get stuck in this paradigm of, oh, BPA is bad, so let's replace it. What do we take? BPM or BPP or whatever, which has the same family, so same structure, and maybe we don't have hazard data for that specific chemical, but it's not hard to see that if it's got a chemical structure that is related to the bad actor, it will also do damage, right? So let's fundamentally change that paradigm. And I think there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of excitement in the research community to also work with regulators and work with industry and investors to help investors not invest into those solutions that become tomorrow's problems.
Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador Sawney, I saw you nodding away there. Would you like to comment on what Jane's just said?
Sure, and thanks, thanks so much for bringing up the question. Thanks so much, Jane and Ted. I think, just from a very realistic perspective, I think part of the struggle that we have as small island governments is that most of the times the innovations don't really reach us. And part of the job of the government is to be able to create that environment that allows the innovation to reach the communities that need it. And this is part of why when we consider policy, we're reaching out to the international community to understand how we can tailor those policies in order to create that environment to support the implementation of those innovations on the ground. So we're all, you mentioned green bond and got me really, really excited, Ted, because, for quite some time, many of our islands have considered innovative sustainable financing mechanisms from debt for nature conversions. We're now getting into the blended finance world. But I think part of the difficulty is being able to explain the viability, to our ministries of finance. That is such a foreign concept. And so there is this sort of tailoring that needs to be done to ensure that they are up to speed, our systems are up to speed in order to uptake the benefits of these kinds of new transformative approaches to financing. And in that way, we're able to create the environment, as you said, Betty, for the young people to help advance the solution on the ground. For us, we take a lot of signals from these international policies and international mechanisms. It's important. It actually allows us to have the political will when we go in front of our cabinet of ministers and try to rationalize the need for this kind of transformation, because it's always a burden to our systems. But it's really positive, and we'd like to continue to participate and hopefully get some of these key changes and innovative changes to the folks on the ground.
Thank you. Very much indeed. In a moment, we're going to move actually to some questions that we're getting in from our audience. But just for anyone who's watching live, do feel free to ask questions of our panel. Ambassador Sawney, just following on from what you said, I just wanted to ask that, I'm getting a sense there are obviously many global challenges that governments are dealing with, not least some of the ones you've already outlined. But I think a bit from what you were just saying, this sort of feels like it follows on. But how can you balance sort of short-term pressures with longer-term objectives and waiting for all this innovation and stuff to come through? How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and it's a very difficult one. I think this is part of the act where we have governments that are very short term. We have administrations that don't go beyond 4 years, and a lot of the planning and thinking is around that short term. And in order to get long-term action in place, we have to adhere to a system, a legislative system that allows us to continue the work past that short-term span of any administration. So it's ensuring that we have the right kinds of frameworks in place that's supported by communities and stakeholders to ensure that there is sustainability built in case there is this shift of political will at the top. Ensuring that the right kind of knowledge and the right kind of tools are delivered to the persons that are actually working on implementing these solutions. So Betty talked about the youth. It's really important that we get them involved. And as Grenada, my minister is actually youth. She's below 30 years old. I'm not going to say how old she is, but it's really, really impressive that we have more youth that are taking up the mantle to lead and understand how government can help bring about this sort of change. So I think, the mindset change is really important. The balancing has to come from ensuring that we put systems in place that are able to deliver in the long term, and that the donors and the funders and the partners that are coming in to help deliver solutions understand that this has to be part of a more programmatic approach rather than a short-term project-based approach. So, and this goes back to how we get resources and how we get financing. Those systems have to be able to respond to the nature of long-term implementation. And as long as we have champions within the space to continue to advocate for that, not just at the domestic level, but at the regional level, where we have regional overarching policy that allows all of our governments to benefit from this approach, it's important.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring Jane back in just to talk about solutions because, Jane, your point of view is that we do have some solutions already.
Yeah, obviously, it's exciting to have innovation and so on, but sometimes I think innovation can also be realizing that we branched off somewhere in the wrong direction and we can go back. We've got inert materials out there already. We have, stainless steel, we have glass. These are really good materials, especially for food contact, which will work in reuse loop. And the nice thing about these inert materials is that you don't have to worry about the chemicals being absorbed, for example, from washing with detergents or from people using those containers for who knows what. They will not absorb these persistent toxic pollutants or other kinds of chemicals. So I think this is an example of where you may need a little bit more capital investment at the start to install these systems, but then the operating costs will come down because contrary to having plastics, for example, in reuse systems that you have to monitor, you have to have these electronic sniffers, to see if they're contaminated and so on throughout the reuse cycles. And they don't have so many loops that they can do, so many cycles like these inert materials. So I do think there are some exciting solutions out there, and also using digitalization, online internet tools, for tracking with RFID and all of that. So there are exciting systemic solutions using materials that we already have.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. We're about to start audience questions. We're getting loads coming through, which is fantastic. I just wanted to dive back to ask you, Alison, about the industry perspective, I guess, really on the plastics treaty. It would be good to hear your view.
Yeah, thank you. What's good and bad is we are seeing since the last Breaking the Plastic Wave report a significant increase in plastics and packaging regulations, like the European packaging waste in California, SB 54. And regulation can be a good thing, but unfortunately, what we're seeing is very patchwork regulation, which is why a global plastics treaty is so important, which is also why Mars was one of the founding members of the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty, which now is 300 organizations across NGOs, brand owners, packaging converters, and even some producers, and they're calling for an ambitious legally binding treaty, again, addressing the full life cycle of plastic. And what's unfortunate now is we are seeing patchwork regulation, and that can be expensive and inefficient for business. And it's not good for investors too, right? I think Ted wants to know if they're investing in something that it's going to be accepted across multiple countries. Unfortunately, right now we face an issue where something that might be encouraged in one country is actually prohibited in another country. And that makes it very hard for companies to innovate and very hard for companies to scale. So we joined the other panelists in calling for an ambitious global plastics treaty sooner than later, so that we can be more efficient with how we invest and scale solutions faster.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come now to some of the questions that we have from our audience. And let's start, whilst we're talking about the treaty, we've had one in saying, do you anticipate that microplastics can be effectively addressed in the treaty, and with what kind of measures? Jane, can I come to you on that one?
Wow, that's a big one. I think when it comes to food packaging, inertness, favor materials that are non-plastic, because obviously then you won't have microplastics, and make sure that they are inert materials. Unfortunately, there's often this misconception that because it's not plastic, it will be safe. But with paper, we see huge amounts of hazardous toxic chemicals leaching, especially if it's recycled paper and cardboard. So that's really a regrettable substitution if it's not very, very carefully managed. And you know, so I think that it needs to be addressed in context. But yes, there are already existing regulations. For example, the ban in the EU for intentionally used microplastics. Other countries' legislations have picked up on that, you know, where it's used in cosmetics, for example, or in fertilizers. The biggest source of microplastics that we know of, at least right now, there's two, it's tires and paint. I think Winnie mentioned that also. Those will be more challenging to address, but here I really think that if the industry and governments come together, there's a lot of room for improvement here. Also to get rid of, you know, the hazardous chemicals, for example, that are leaching out of tires. 6-PPD is one of those, which all the ocean people will know. Ted is nodding, yeah, because it kills salmon. So I think, yes, let's tackle microplastics, but we do that in context with addressing chemicals and also with how we use what materials in which context. But it would be very important to have microplastics in there, yeah.
Okay, fab, thank you. Another question that's come in that says many countries lack the infrastructure to manage plastic waste. What practical steps can help bridge this gap without widening economic inequality? Perhaps, Betty, I could come to you on that one.
Yeah, I do agree. Respect to that, I think it's quite obvious that a lot of developing countries still struggle when it comes to managing plastic waste. And even whilst Jane was talking, I was thinking about the microplastics she was talking about. Seeing that now we talk about upcycle, talk about recycling, we have pellets, and this goes down into our ocean bodies. So I think that in general, it'll be quite difficult because our systems are not that positioned to have all the needed infrastructures to manage the plastic waste directly. So what we need to infuse into the system now is a lot of reuse, a lot of behavioral changes, a lot of reduction. And that's why we came about the project of installing refillable stations for water. So communities go with their water bottles, go get direct access to water, and also trying to inculcate recyclable materials. So trying to use handbags, discarded materials, trying to form them to create bags that people could send to the market. So I feel like it's a very tough question. But at the end of the day, we just need to tap into our previous life or our previous way of living. At the beginning of the conversation, you were talking about what were we doing before plastics came into the system. So I believe that it's time for us to think back, reflect back, and go back to our olden modern way of living. And Africa, I started from Africa. We just started going into the front of development, and then we started losing our roots. So it's time to return back to our roots. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. A question come in, I think probably for either Ted or Alison, but how do you envisage this report being received? And do you want to see businesses use this information to change their strategies so they can truly move away from the business as usual scenario? Ted, can I come to you on that first?
Sure. Look, I think that there's a certain amount of kinetic energy that has to be put into these things. I think the first report was widely distributed. I think there were 1,000+ people on the call, and there was a great push on the back of it. One of the things that I think is very powerful that I'm taking away from today is if you look at that group of people or organizations that are being put together, it's really breaking down silos. And it's really, you can choose your word, multidisciplinary, cross-cutting. The term I heard from Lonely Whale ages ago was radical collaboration. I think that bringing together these different disciplines is what really helps force these things through. If you take too narrow a view and say, I'm going to convince this person of this or this person of that, I think it's not as strong a proposition. So yes, I do think this report can, again, be a foundational piece for the next several years. Look forward to the third version, of course, Winnie. But I think that this whole idea of taking this incredible work and thousands and thousands of hours and all this collaboration and really making the best use of it and pushing it out, I think it's all on us to do that.
Yeah, agreed. Alison, can I get your thoughts on that too?
Yes, I'm hoping that this report will both influence the investment community, industry, as well as legislators, right? We're at a critical point for the plastics treaty. We're seeing EPR sprout out all over the place. And we can look to what works. Right? There's EPR systems that work well, and there's EPR systems that don't work well. And countries that are just starting have an opportunity to leapfrog the systems that have been put in place for a long time. So I encourage legislators to look at the report, look at the data being used here, and also look at where legislation is working, where it isn't, so that we aren't starting from scratch and learning from scratch every time we put in new EPR or other types of regulation.
Okay, thank you. A question for Ambassador Sawney. Someone asking, since you are expecting the future international treaty to be the result of a compromise, what do you think will be hard, yet absolutely key to safeguard in that treaty? That's quite a tough question.
That is, but it's also a really great question. And I think that's part of the basis of why we haven't really made the strides that we we're hoping to make within the ambitious timeline that we set out for ourselves. You know, as I said before, I think all the right elements are there. It's just a matter of ensuring that we capture that in a way that we can build consensus, right? We don't want to deliver a treaty just to deliver a treaty, and it's not very effective. This is something that we know that at least from the Alliance of Small Island Developing States and many other governments, it's not something that's acceptable. But at the same time, we have to consider that there are a number of countries that rely on plastic production that would like to understand and ensure that the science and the basis of the science is something that's acceptable to them. And then when you get into these sort of treaty negotiations process, it gets a little bit tricky to try to form a baseline that everyone can align with. And so for us, we want to ensure that the objective of Resolution 514, which is to ensure that we deliver an internationally legally binding instrument that looks at solution across the entire life cycle of plastic, is the foundation of the plastics treaty. And we're not willing to change the scope of that. This is already agreed in 2022 by a number of countries. And certainly we want to ensure that the plastics treaty can evolve, right? This is not a sort of instrument that cannot change. And so part of how we're we're looking to support language is to ensure that we put in place processes that can be managed by the COP that allows us to evolve with new information. That allows us to consider, as Jane mentioned, maybe new ways at looking at regulating chemicals, based on groupings rather than an individual chemical. So there's all of these elements that we're trying to achieve. And I think, like I said, the right elements are there. It's just getting to that compromise that then allows us to have a process following the development of the treaty and the launch of the treaty that gives us the right sort of tools to ensure the effective implementation of the treaty at the end of the day. And the treaty has a purpose, but I think, as many of us have been saying, this requires a collective response from all stakeholders, including business. Unfortunately, the treaty cannot mandate what private sector or what business does, but we're hoping that it has the right signals in place that allows us to have a process where we can work together and ensure that there is, and I think Alison pointed this out so beautifully, that there is the kind of response that is not too fragmented, that doesn't allow us to put in place mechanisms or invest in mechanisms for solutions that are not effective. We have to do this as part of a holistic vision. And I guess back to the point someone raised about the waste management system, I just want to say, when we first conceived of alternatives to plastics, these bioplastics, no one ever sort of thought about what happens on the waste management end. And so a lot of the waste management, the current waste management infrastructure that many countries have at the moment cannot process bioplastics, even though it's an eco-friendly alternative. The infrastructure cannot process this. There needs to be further investment in infrastructure that would allow countries to be compliant. And unfortunately, while it's a good change, it puts us in a worse scenario because we can't really tackle that issue.
Okay, Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to welcome back Winnie, who is now with us on the panel. And Winnie, a question for you, something we have talked about, but not in as much detail, but how does recycling contribute to plastic pollution? That's a question that's come in from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Louise, and thank you for that question. So while recycling is a part of the solution set, the recycling process itself can create microplastic emissions due to the mechanical processes of shedding and washing. But these are actually sources that can be managed with straightforward capture technologies that exist today. The bigger question under discussion is really whether recycling is actually reducing the amount of plastics being produced. Are we creating less plastic in the first place? And new measures will need to be put in place to ensure that the cycle is happening. And then finally, we need to recognize that the important concern about the toxicity of recycled plastic, as Jane mentioned earlier with black plastic, solving this problem will require innovation to redesign plastic and simplify plastic chemicals. It will also involve improvements to collection, sorting, and recycling strategies.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Just Jane, did you want to jump on the back of that?
Yeah, thanks. Not necessarily to comment on recycling, although there's a interesting report that came out today as well, in addition to the Pew report on recycling. But I just wanted to also quickly mention that bioplastics, I mean, that's also a hot topic. It's actually also being confused sometimes a little bit. There's, bioplastics, which means they're made with renewable carbon as feedstock, which as such, of course, is good because we're not using fossil carbon. But on the other hand, it's also really important to look at how that renewable carbon is being generated, because sometimes if it's industrial agriculture, the carbon input, so to say, to produce that renewable carbon can be even bigger than if you just use fossil carbon as a feedstock. So, and it has impacts on biodiversity, on freshwater use and so on. But then also during the use phase, these bioplastics can lead to sometimes even more hazardous chemicals or other types of chemicals which are not studied in detail yet. So I think, and they can also generate microplastics, of course. There's one type of biodegradable plastics, which is the other way to talk about bioplastics, that they kind of disappear in nature. And I think that's what the ambassador was alluding to, that some of these kinds of plastics require industrial composting facilities that don't just degrade in the ambient situation or in environments. And there's one subtype which are these oxo-biodegradables, which have chemicals that will break down the polymer backbone, but then they produce microplastics. So they're gone to the visible eye. They look like they've disappeared, but they're still in the environment. So it's super, super important to have very, very careful control of what these materials are that are being put on the market, that we don't end up with, these regrettable substitutions.
Okay, Jane, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. I've got one more quick question that's come in for you, Ted, just about data. Someone watching saying that while data is necessary, there's also a lot of bad data out there, bad data. What criteria or standards would you recommend so that data that's collected and generated can contribute to positive action?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd hark back to the comment about CDP. They've been at this a long time in terms of generating questionnaires and then testing them over time and altering them where appropriate. And the notion of peer review comes in a lot of different ways. It comes in the academic community. It comes in the finance community. People often look to advisory panels. So back to the construction of what you're all doing here, I think you've really embedded some real in your thought leader category with the universities and research centers. You've pulled them on. But I think because just this last conversation here about how technical it gets so quickly, and then you multiply that across the value chain that has all these different upstream, downstream elements to it, it's just going to take a lot of rolling up your sleeves, making sure you have real experts, and that when they get together and validate something, that we all do our very best to inject that into the data ecosystem that I talked about.
Okay,
Happy to
lovely.
follow up more if people want to continue that conversation. I'm keenly interested in it myself.
Thank you. We are going to have to wrap in a moment. And before I do that, I guess I just wanted to throw a question to all of you to all get if you can give us a brief response to this. But looking ahead to the next year, what do you think success looks like in terms of shifting the dial or coming up with positive action based on what we've been talking about today? And perhaps I could start with you, Ambassador, on that. Just a brief answer. For the next year, what does positive success or action look like to you?
I think for us is being able to have a better process to support the international treaty negotiations. So that's something that we're a strong advocate for, and we'll continue to participate in those discussions and how we can improve that. And I think from the government and just national government perspective is to continue to work within our region. We don't have very strong regional policy to help ground a lot of the new innovations and solutions that are coming through to help tackle the issue. So we'll continue to work on strengthening regional coordination, strengthening regional policy, so that once we do have a plastics treaty delivered, we are well placed to be able to advance the implementation.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Betty, what about you? What does success look like looking ahead in the next year? Just a brief answer if you can.
Okay, I think success to me looks like a system where young people are trusted to be able to drive the next future innovation that we want to see, to go beyond government just putting in the policies and then directly doing the implementation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Ted, what about you?
I would say celebrating the wins. We have a large amount of different types of innovation we're talking about, all kinds of initiatives. I think it's a portfolio in a sense. We don't know exactly which ones are going to work until they do. But when they do work, we should make sure those are elevated and brought into full view, because that was a version of saying, come on in, the water's fine, and getting more people to join in.
Lovely. Thank you. Jane, just your brief thoughts. What does success look like to you in the next year?
Success would be if we can get the issue of chemicals into the disclosure or reporting that companies are doing to their investors. I think that is really something where we can start a million conversations in the supply chain, but also get, the consumer advocates interested in the issue of this, toxic trespass in a way of being exposed without consent to these chemicals. So
thank you. Okay, great. And Alison, how about you?
I think the single best thing that can have is a global plastics treaty, right? That's legally binding. And in lieu of that, looking at ways to harmonize regulation that exists and continuation of investments into alternatives and really accelerating the investments into alternatives.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to our panel. We are going to wrap it there, but we're really, really grateful for you taking part and for all your insight. For anyone watching or watching this afterwards, if you want to read the report in full, you can find it at pew.org/plastic wave. So please do have a look. But I'm going to pass back now to Dr. Winnie Lau to give her final thoughts. Winnie.
Thank you, Louise. So as you've heard today, under the current global trajectory, 1 garbage truck of plastic per second will be entering the environment by 2040. But that doesn't have to be our future. As the Breaking the Plastic Wave 2025 report shows, the solutions are on hand and ready to be implemented. It will not be easy to transform the plastic system, but it will be necessary. The vision for the system transformation involves upstream and downstream solutions working together to significantly cut plastic pollution and at the same time maintaining a level of service, convenience, and utility similar to what we enjoy today. What we get in return is reduced harm to human health, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, lower costs, more jobs and business opportunities, and improving the lives and livelihoods of the most vulnerable workers. Achieving this vision will need support from all facets of society, including governments, businesses, finance houses, scientific experts, and really everyone already working hard to protect us and future generations. And as our panelists today and the numerous experts, too many to name, who advised and reviewed Breaking the Plastic Wave 2025 show, there are many across society who are ready to do so. Betty so poignantly stated earlier, plastic pollution has become personal, with it being found inside her and our bodies. This is not just a pollution problem, but about people, planet, and human health. The urgency to solve this problem is real. The world must seize the opportunities, including the opportunity to agree a global plastics treaty that sustainable solutions present. With international collaboration, ambition, and urgency, the world can achieve a cleaner, safer, healthier, and more prosperous world in a single generation. Thank you to all of our panelists today, to Louise for hosting this event, and to all of you for attending. You can read the full report at pewtrusts.org/plasticwave. Thank you very much.